responsible should the ideal government be for the success of the individual? What are the minimum responsibilities of the state to each person? My name's Dylan, and to discuss this question, today I'm joined by Mac, who's going to York University and planning on majoring in political science. They were also both treasurer and vice chair of the Teen Advisory Board, a government board specifically for teens in our city to have a voice in government. With them, we'll be discussing the functions, basis, and responsibilities of government, as well as what would warrant the government to have a responsibility in the first place. Let's discuss. Hello, and welcome back to Philosophy Dialogues. Today we'll be discussing the moral responsibilities of government. So, how responsible should the ideal government be for the success of the individual? And this question is not about politics, but what the minimum responsibilities of the state are to each person. So it's important to clarify what we mean by this. When we say ideal, we're not focusing on the government structure. We're not trying to argue for a democratic government, a dictatorship, some mix of both. Instead, we're arguing for functions. So what should this government do? What should this government be responsible for? And that's kind of universal across any structure of government. So if we believe, for instance, a government should be responsible for education, that's going to be the same responsibility of a democratic government or a dictatorship or what have you. Today, I'm joined by Mac, and I guess the first question I want to ask you is, what do you believe the primary function of government should be?
Providing for its citizens, definitely.
Okay, so when we say provide, do you mean like provide protection, provide goods, or what?
Provide all of the services and basic needs to fulfill basic human rights, and then the tools so that each person can have a high quality of life.
Yeah, interesting. Because to me, actually, when I think provide and like the primary function, to me, I think it's provide protection. And I think that's where everything else can kind of come from. The state is kind of defined as, by political scientists at least, as the monopoly on power or violence in a region. And I know that sounds very negative, but basically what that's saying is the state has the power to enforce and also protect. So enforce rules, protect citizens. And to me, at least, that's kind of like the building blocks of everything. But I think we were talking earlier, and you had a kind of different understanding of what a state should be, or I guess a government should be founded on.
Yeah, I think that a government, nation, state, whatever, should be founded on distributing resources to all of its citizens and focus on, I think that war and, military protection is kind of a peripheral thing in kind of a literal sense too. It's on the outsides. And the majority of the activity should be focused on the inside, because you can't really have a strong military without first providing for its citizens.
Yeah, I know. I actually agree with you there. And I think that the military, like at least in modern governments, is kind of no longer as required. But I think you mentioned like in early societies in Mesopotamia, off camera we were discussing about this, and you mentioned how those societies eventually were developed for the group benefit. But I would argue that when you have groups of like millions and millions of people in a country, at some point not everyone has the same goals. So you have to have some sort of unifying structure for your government if you want to create policies and enforce changes, and you have to have some form of authority in that, which is the monopoly on violence. You have like some sort of strength to be able to enforce that, even if you never have to use it. It exists.
I think that's a really bleak outlook.
Yeah, it is a really bleak outlook on things, but unfortunately, it's had to happen that way. Usually, when the government's policy is respected, because people recognize the government as the authority, things go smoothly and no demonstration of power is needed. But there have been situations in the past where the government's policy is not being respected. For instance, in Little Rock, Arkansas, um, when, upon order of desegregation, Black students weren't allowed in the school building despite their legal right to be there, and the National Guard had to be sent in to protect the Black students to be able to study at the school. Um, so I would argue that the the basic need of government is to be able to have the ability to enforce whatever policies it chooses, and then after that we can that's why I view it as a building block, and then after that you can start having more policies from that. I guess an interesting question spawning from that though is if the government funds uh, violence in the name of protection, that eventually comes back at it. So an example I have of that is the Mujahideen. If you don't know, the Mujahideen is currently a terrorist group, but it used to be funded to fight Soviet troops. I guess my question would be, well, first off, do you have any like examples similar to that?
All right, so Dylan is referencing a conversation earlier when I
Yeah.
first learned about what's it called again?
Mujahideen? Yeah.
Mujahideen.
Yeah.
Um, he described it as it was a militant group that we funded during the Soviet-Afghan War during Ronald Reagan's presidency to push the Soviet troops outside of Afghanistan. And then in response to this question, I was like, oh, that reminds me of the plot of Age of Ultron, the Marvel Studios film production.
Yeah.
Because it was like, what is the level of responsibility on the United States government on this now terrorist group, once seeming protector? So in the movie Age of Ultron, Tony Stark wants to put a suit around the world, and that he wants an Iron Man suit like over every nation to protect it. And this the algorithm is called Ultron, and that it would it's a peacekeeper. But Ultron is developed and believes that the best way to keep peace is to eradicate the human population so that it can evolve to protect itself. That doesn't make any sense, but it's a Marvel movie. Anyway, the point was that what is the responsibility on Tony Stark? His intention was to keep the peace, but in practice made a murder machine. The rest of the Avengers said that all of it was his fault because he knew the consequences of what his actions could be, and he had all this power, and now it totally backfired. So is it his fault? They say yes. I say yes. So is it the United States' fault that this group became a terrorist group? Well, first of all, they were always a terrorist group. That's just my opinion, though. At least it sounds like it. I
Yeah.
didn't study this. I'm getting this all secondhand from your boy. So, is it their fault that they hate the U.S. now? Yeah, you gave them a bunch of guns. Don't allocate things to a third party you could do yourself.
I yeah, I would say that I'm not super well versed if the US is responsible for the Mujahideen like turning on them. But I would say the US is responsible for, I guess, I get the amount of power the Mujahideen now has, because we did give them tons of weapons and resources. Um, so yeah, I would agree. Also, I love that example from the Avengers. But yeah, I would say even if you had good intentions, you do have some moral responsibility if those good intentions backfire.
And for the sake to save my own hide, I don't know anything about this subject.
That's fine. Um, um, but that's an interesting question, though, of moral responsibility. Um, and I guess like I can generalize that to asking what makes the government morally responsible for something. I guess what's your thoughts on that?
Wait, is the question what makes the government morally responsible for something?
Yeah.
Okay. Um, that's really broad. I would say if they had a hand in it in some way, if they uplifted a system that only helps a certain group of people, then they have a responsibility to help the marginalized people.
Hmm. Yeah,
So,
I'd agree with that. And then, well, I think there's actually two ways government can be morally responsible for something. So
mhm.
the first is, as you said, is if they had like a direct hand in causing the problem. Um, but my other, but my other reasoning is if a problem existed before that government, um, regardless of whether that government caused it or I guess worsened that problem, if a different government has been able to successfully have like a positive impact on that issue, then I would argue that every government has some moral responsibility um, to improve that issue because it's been proven that a government can have a positive impact um, on that. So I know I'm talking in very vague terms, but for instance, if we take a look at Denmark, for instance, um, or excuse me, Finland. Uh, Finland's approach to education has eventually landed them in the first place in world rankings for education quality, and that kind of shows to us that education is something that can be improved. It's not some issue that's untouchable or unfixable, um, and that's kind of my logic for all I guess the government's ability to solve all issues. What do you think about that?
Okay, even if something hadn't been done before, that doesn't mean something can't be fixed.
Sure.
So, like the United States has never been equal in distributing education, but there are organizations out there that are trying to increase the income taxes of poor neighborhoods so that they can be funneled towards the education systems. Like
Yeah,
even though that like it's
I'm
never been
sorry.
equal, like they're trying to go there.
Hmm. Yeah, I should say that for a government to solve an issue, at some point, a government had to be the first one. So, could we say that a government has a moral responsibility to try to solve the issues it faces then?
Yes, just
Okay,
period. Yes.
just period, yeah. So then, if they have a moral responsibility to attempt to solve that issue, and it's been done before, that also kind of proves that that issue can be solved too. Mhm.
Yeah, it's definitely more evidence that it wouldn't be an effort in vain.
Yeah. Um, yeah, because it's been done before. Um, so I guess that begs the question, if all problems have been in some way solved, then does this mean we should expect our government to solve all problems in front of us? I would personally argue no. I'm not a huge utopian. I'm probably a bit more of a pessimist. I believe every government should try to solve um, the problems it faces, but I'm not sure we should be able to expect that perfect government. But what do you think?
Obviously, nothing can be perfect, but we should expect our government to try and do everything it can to support its citizens the best way it can. So I don't know if you want to call that a utopia. I call that basic decency.
Yeah. Yeah. Basic decency to me is attempting to try to solve those problems. I would utopia to me is solving every one of them. So Yeah, I agree. Basic decency for the win. We should definitely, every government should at least try to solve um, the problems it faces. And that's where the moral responsibility comes in. By choosing to ignore problems, that government has moral culpability and those problems worsening or those problems even existing.